step right up and get your tickets for another moment in gaming history. Hi, I'm the GeekStorian and welcome back to my channel, or if it's your first time here, officially welcome to the channel. This is a segment I call Moments in Gaming History. This is where we go over various different moments in the history of video games that I or many people think are important, and dive into why they're important and try to learn a little bit about that might affect the future of gaming, or at least give us some perspective on the things that we often take for granted now. Now, that said, no gaming history channel would be complete if they didn't cover the particular topic we're going to cover today. Video game crash of 1983. Particularly if you're talking from somebody who came from the United States. This was a fairly big event in the video game industry, at least as it pertains to the States. However, I don't feel that this topic is quite as cut and dry as just saying ET destroyed the market. It's not. There were a lot of moving pieces and components that went on around this time that made things particularly challenging, and how things were all kind of tied together that made things particularly perilous for the industry during the early years of its growth. A bit of greed, mixed with a bit of overreach, caused massive amount of problems, and almost a complete downturn of the industry as a whole. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started and dig into this. I think you guys are going to find this one interesting. I know I did. The video game industry had been around for a while, from the Magnavox Odyssey all the way to the Fairchild Channel F. Steady progress had been made in areas of not only the arcades, but home consoles. Then, in 1977, a bit of a convergence happened. Atari. Atari launched and became the next big thing in video games, albeit with a bit of a rocky start. For more on that, see my full video on the rise and fall of that company. The company made steady progress, being known as one of the places to work, with flexible hours and rumors of a fairly wild lifestyle for most employees and managers. Anyone who wanted to be serious about video game development worked there or wanted to. Not only due to those rumors, but because Atari was smart enough to lock down cart manufacturing so that only they could produce carts for the system. So, if you wanted to make games for the console, you had to work at Atari. And since they were the most advanced, and at this point really the only game in town with the Magnavox Odyssey leagues behind, and the Fairchild filling shortly after Atari started up, everyone wanted a piece of Atari's game. The problem was not everything was perfect as people were led to believe behind Atari's doors. They were relatively heavy-handed and stingy with a few key things. 1. They refused to give any of the developers royalties or even credit towards any of the games they worked on. This led to a lot of frustration and eventual dissension in Atari's ranks. Most of these people went off to work for companies like Williams, who was working more in the arcade space, but a few went on to make their own video development houses. Activision, in fact, was one of these such game houses. Now, Atari tried to promptly sue several of these companies for stealing trade secrets from them, but they were shut down by the court system, stating that they could not stop other manufacturers from making software compatible with their system. This essentially solidified the right for third-party development houses. This sent waves through the market, and some of these people who left would even go on to make their own consoles, like Intellivision and ColecoVision. Atari still had the lead in the market, but it was starting to struggle. It was having difficulty adjusting to how fast the market was actually changing around them. They cut the cost of their consoles, expecting to make up the difference in software sales. They also tried to pump out more games more and more rapidly. This meant cutting down the development time and the quality assurance testing, leading to a massive drop in the quality of games coming out. Many other consoles meant many of the same games were on many different platforms, some with better quality, which you would think would make the market more robust. But Atari had such a heavy lead in the market, and they were still seen as the market, not just part of it. So every move they made affected other manufacturers and other development houses. The other issue is that, in a lot of ways, the technology really hadn't evolved much in the home game space. While arcades were doing side-scrolling and vertical-scrolling games, many of the home games were still using static screens for much of the action, with a new screen drawn when you transition. Some of the later ones, like Intellivision, could handle this to an extent, but the home market was vastly behind the growth of its arcade market. Now, this in and of itself isn't necessarily a major issue. Arcades were often ahead of consoles all the way through the 16-bit era. The difference here was far more vast, though. Given how fast things were developing, It also didn't help that the games made by many of these early consoles were focused almost exclusively on getting the highest score. That's a far cry from the more story-driven games of the 8-bit era consoles and up. On top of all these other issues, the PC market was starting to have a lower and lower point of entry, with many of them pointing out to consumers that they should drop the console and buy a PC, since it could do more than just play games.
Why buy just a video game from Atari or Intellivision? Invest in the wonder computer of the 1980s for under $300, the Commodore VIC-20. Unlike games, it has a real computer keyboard. With the Commodore VIC-20, the whole family can learn computing at home. Plays great games, too. Under $300, the wonder computer of the 1980s, the Commodore VIC-20.
This further increased the competition in an arena that just 5 years previously, Atari had fully dominated. Atari was struggling, as almost any company would do when the landscape around it changed so dramatically in such a short period of time. From starting up in 1977 and owning the market, to having to mature enough and to weather this amount of growth and encroachment on the industry, where you had almost completely, solely been running, would have been a struggle for even a more established company. Atari just hadn't been around that long. Sure, they had worked in the arcade and pinball market, but their home console market was still very, very young at this time. To give you an example, most consoles these days run anywhere between a 3 and 7 year lifespan. The 5-year span of all this happening in order to keep up, Atari would have probably had to drop both the 5200 and the 7800 right at or around within 5 years to keep up with how fast the technology was changing, which is almost completely unreasonable for any company, and yet here they were. So it should come as no surprise that they cut corners and rushed things out the door. People in turn got frustrated with the quality of what they were getting, particularly with personal computers getting cheaper and cheaper. A few of the big nails in the coffin were games like Pac-Man and E.T. These two were later and relatively rushed ports and licensed titles to the Atari system. Atari had bet really hard on these two titles, producing millions of them, expecting them to be huge sellers in the holiday season and catapulting them into skyrocketing sales. I mean, who didn't know about Spielberg's latest blockbuster, or Pac-Man Fever? They could have done just that, but because they were so heavily rushed, and even though at least Pac-Man sold well, it did very little to keep consumers from losing confidence in a rather young market. With no good way of finding out whether a game was good or bad, and that there were very few, if any, magazines covering the industry at this time, and no internet for people to reference, people were getting as many bad titles as they were good ones. There was also no rating system or oversight with many published games, meaning a lot of games became of an adult nature. This led to parents buying games meant for more adult consumers and handing them to their kids, and you can imagine the outrage that had. Then in the first quarter of 1983, Atari presented their sales margins for the end of 1982. They had expected an at least 50% profit. Frankly, asking 50% was a bit much, as at the time these figures came out, they were closer to 42 to 50% of the entire market. Far cry from what they had been years in past. So expecting the same kind of sales growth was, at best, unreasonable. And instead, they got a paltry 10%. This was a crushing blow. Confidence in the industry was gone. Stocks crashed, and games that were selling for full price were now on clearance. The American market, at least, was done with video games. That's right, the American market. Outside the US, Japan was still keen on arcades. Europe was big into the PC market with the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum ZX. These markets stayed totally stable. That's not to say that the ripple effects didn't hit those markets, they just didn't devastate them the way they did the US market. The US market itself, well, it wouldn't recover till nearly 1985 when the Famicom would make its way to American shores in the form of the Nintendo Entertainment System. And yes, I have a video of that on my channel too. Stuff like this is why I like doing this channel. It gives you a viewpoint into the past so that you can draw parallels into the present that we can hopefully manage to avoid. Today, we enjoy a relatively stable gaming market, but you can see some of the underpinnings of what caused this last crash in it. Quicker development times, harder adherence to deadlines and not quality, massively predatory tactics meant to milk as much money out of the consumers as they can rather than providing a solid quality product. It's my hope that videos like this can in some small way raise awareness of where things like this lead the first time so that there isn't a second one. However, I should get off my soapbox and thank all of you who got this far in the video. I deeply appreciate you spending part of your day with me. And if I can impose on you one more time, if you could hit that like button, I'd really appreciate it. And if you're not subscribed, please consider doing so. It really helps my channel out when you do these things. As always, thank you once again for visiting my channel, and until next time, happy gaming!